Today we're going to be talking about public relations and advocacy strategies, introducing communities to new projects. I oftentimes, kind of the idea behind this is money is tight when you're doing this type of work, and you don't have the money to pay a consultant to help you with your public relations, or you don't necessarily have an advocacy person on staff with your group. So I would think that we're going to get into a lot of things that apply both to affordable housing development as well as other projects, and hopefully a little bit broader than that, programs as well. So just to give you a little bit of information about these two gentlemen sitting next to me here. Ben Brown, to my left, your right here. Ben, before moving full-time into communications consulting, Ben was a career journalist with national newspapers and magazines, including 16 years on the founding staffs of USA Today and Time Inc.'s Coastal Living magazine. He's the co-author or author of 4 books, didn't know this, ranging from behind-the-scenes narrative of college football team in pursuit of a national championship to an exploration of the principled management style of the Salvation Army. Also available. Flying off the shelves, though, so you're going to need to go get yours right now. Since the early 2000s, Ben has worked with public, nonprofit, and private sector leaders to better frame communications strategies. He was communications director for Governor's Reports in the wake of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. He served in the same role for 2 ambitious regional outreach and planning efforts in the 7 westernmost counties in North Carolina, the Mountain Landscapes Initiative in 2008, and the Opt-in Southwest North Carolina project in 2013 through 2014. Ben has been a partner in the international consulting firm Placemakers since 2008, working in public outreach and communication support for coding and urban design projects in 15 states and 3 Canadian provinces. Tyran Hill, over here to my right, your left, is a native of Lexington, North Carolina, a graduate of North Carolina A&T State University and Case Western Reserve University Mandel School. He has experience in government housing regulations, affordable housing policy, and advocacy and community and economic development. He currently works with the North Carolina Housing Coalition as their local and regional policy officer while serving on the Wake County Affordable Housing and Steering Committee and the Town of Carborough's Affordable Housing Advisory Commission. All right, and with that, our format today is that Tyran and Ben first are each going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to, I've got a few questions to tie some ideas together back between the two of them, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So with that, here's your mic, Ben.
Is this actually working? You hear me? Oh, great. All right. First of all, I want to see who's in the room. How many people are private sector involved with real estate development and some as sales, construction, that sort of thing? How many people like that? Okay. How many people are public sector, government employees involved with policy, management, planning, that sort of thing? Okay, great. A small group. And nonprofits. Okay, now we know who's in the room. So the idea is, the things I'm going to try to do in 15 minutes or so is try to model some of the storytelling techniques that I've learned often the hard way about reaching an audience first of all and activating them in some direction to do something, which is what all of you probably are involved in. And depending on which of those sectors that we just described, you may have different tasks at different points. Same goals maybe, same big goals, but different tasks at different points. First of all, storytelling, is very hot. It's become a very hot idea. Storytelling. There are a lot of corporations that have hired people out of Hollywood to come speak to their staffs about how to tell better stories all the time. And now when I work in projects. I'm introduced often as the storytelling expert. I'm thinking about changing the name of my card from storyteller to story maintenance and repair, because because where we are now in the environment that we're all working in now is a very difficult place to tell shared stories. What we have is people showing up in rooms all with my story that I need you to understand. And your problem is you don't get my story. So we are often involved in rooms, especially if you do what I've been doing for the last 10 years and stand in front of a group at a zoning workshop. That's a really fun place to experience all the failures in your life about storytelling. So I've learned a lot of these things the hard way. So first of all, let's just acknowledge how important stories are in our lives. In many ways, I mean, it's how we describe where we came from, who we are now, and where we hope to go. The kind of person we are, and the kind of person we want to be. The kind of place we came from, and the kind of place we want to go to. So it connects all the important things in our life. It connects through geography, from place to place. It connects through time, from when you were small, or even the family you came from, to what your hopes are for the future. So stories are a big deal. Well, stories have three components. They have a setting of some kind, which is not just a geographic setting, but it's a setting in time. It's the kind of context for the story. They have characters, which could be a very wide range of characters, not just human beings. Sometimes they could be animals or mythical beasts and that sort of thing. And they also have the action or a plot. And so those, no matter what we're talking about, from one all stories share those kind of components. Where we are in our story stuck position right now is that we are in the plot, in the action part. We seem to be stuck in the middle in a lot of places, and the way I'm suggesting that is that an action in a story moves from some basic kind of understanding. If it's a romantic comedy, it starts with the meet cute part, where the boy and the girl run into some really cute places, so they literally bump into to one another someplace. And then the second part of the story is where they have a falling out, or there's confusion or misidentity, or he didn't understand this, or she didn't understand that, and they break apart. And then the third part is the resolution, where they get back together and live happily ever after. If it's in a heroic story of some kind, you have the birth of the hero, or the transformation of some kind of hero, often unwillingly facing obstacles, and there's the kind of stuff in the middle where you face the obstacles, and then the hero or a group of heroes overcome the barriers in front of them. At the end, that's resolved. What I think is a lot of us get stuck in the conflict part. We don't have a really good narrative for getting us from where we think we came from to where we want to be. We just get stuck in that middle part where we're facing the conflict. So there is no good story that doesn't go all the way to the end, that doesn't go to the part where things get resolved, where things happen, where people are transformed, or in the case in affordable housing, where things get built that you can point to that says that's a success story. So quite often when we talk about communications and outreach, we talk about, are voices represented? Are the people in the room people who can be affected by whatever is going to happen? We need to hear their stories. And quite often in unsuccessful projects I've been involved in, it's been a kind of people have acted as stenographers. Oh, let me write down the things you said. I have a clip chart here. Now I'm going to write down all the things that concern you and bother you, and we'll just make a list of all those. And so you can be sure you've been heard because I've written them down. And now I leave, and I've got everything's written down, and I report back, and I say, well, we contacted 47% of the people in a particular neighborhood. We were represented by the African American folks, by the Latino folks. See what a great job of outreach we did. We counted all the bodies. We checked all the boxes, and so we got representatives of all the voices in the room. Well, I want to. How many really good stories in your life have been told that end up with a meeting? I mean, how can you tell a story in which the end part, that the most successful resolution part of the story is a meeting, and yet almost all of us concentrate on body counts, on reporting to the feds or to our clients how many people we got in a room. The real test of a really good story, how to tell a really good story, is what happens at the end. What's been transformed? What can you point to and say, not only did we listen to you, but here is our response to what we heard. That's a really good story. And so to change the perception of people, to change the impact of a story, you have to change the reality. You have to plan your story in certain ways that it helps create the reality that you want to happen. So what's really important, therefore, if the reality at the end is what you want, then you have to plan the beginning of the outreach in order to get where you need to go. Now, because we know that the setting that we're all involved in now is a setting of polarization and of conflict and confusion and contradiction, that means that we have to figure out some way to begin telling the story, to agree on some things at the very beginning that unites and connects as many of the people in the room as we get. It's not enough just to have all the different voices of diversity in the room. We got to figure out some way to get at the high altitude things that connect all those diverse voices. And it turns out that because we happen to be human beings, there's a lot of things we have in common. Stacy Guffey, who's sitting down in the front, Stacy and I worked together for a long time in the rural region, and Stacy's still there in the rural region, working on the success stories that eluded us for so long. But one trick that Stacy and I used to do in public conferences is Stacy would be in the audience, and I would be talking to the crowd, and we would say, we believe we have these special kind of mind reading capabilities, and so we want you, and we'd be talking to planners who do comp plans and strategic plans and that sort of thing, and we would say, we think we can read your minds of everything you would put into a comp plan as your high altitude goals. We think that's possible. We're so good at this mind reading. And so then Stacy would go out into the audience, and he would, if we had a Swami hat, we would put that on him, but that wasn't available. But he would say, I'd say, Stacy, are you getting vibrations from standing next to a planner? And he'd say yes. He says, I think that I'm getting good vibration from this person. He would get these. Okay, give us one thing on your comp plan. And so they would say something like, well, affordable housing is really important to be able to include, have people get affordable housing for everything they need. And I said, oh, that's incredible. And so then I would reveal a thing behind. We had a chart up on the board, and I would take off one of the elements there, and on it would be inclusion, affordable housing. I said, oh, incredible. And so we would go through the steps so that we got to the point where we had 10 stages, or 10 principles that we would say we were reading people's minds that would be on every comp plan. And all those principles, we challenged anyone in the room to tell us what is on their comp plan or what they're proposing that was different from any of the 10 that we came to the room with. So what that suggested to them and to all of us is that there's a lot of things in common that we have. There's a lot of things that we really believe in if we talk at a high altitude. The problem comes when we start getting down to the details. When we start saying, okay, who has to give up? Yes, we want good transit, but don't we want good parking, and don't we want huge, wide highways at the same time? A contradiction. If we're going to get stuck in the middle in the outreach program, we would just note unlimited parking, unlimited transit, and walk away from the problem. But you have to have a story that begins to resolve those contradictions. So if you don't do that, if you don't plan ahead, you can't get to that end with a story of accomplishment. So let me just a few lessons learned about working in this environment of polarity. One is that the more complex and the more contradictory the situation is, the 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 lower you have to shape your expectations. You have to pick something. You have to pick something that you know you can do that would satisfy those attributes that everybody agrees on, that hits all those goals. So you pick something small and you work as fast as you can. If you were in the section with Bruce Toller a few minutes ago, he's working in small incremental elements, using those as models to move forward to a story of accomplishment. It's very similar in a storytelling that journalists do. Often, when they have a complex story, they start out with identifying a particular character who represents all the problems and the issues and the kind of story they have to go through to get things resolved. We call it an anecdotal lead in a journalistic story. So that's the way you get from complexity to so you walk through that story with somebody you can identify with. The same thing with a story of development, and especially affordable development. You start out with an anecdotal lead, with a small scale example of things that hits all the buttons you want to hit. Yeah, that when you establish the goals of the overall goals of a community or a neighborhood, you try to pick out one thing that seems that you can do with the least possible resistance in the shortest possible time, that everybody can point to and says, okay, you were listening to me. I get that you were here. You validated the trust I put in you, and you created something that I can believe in. And then you celebrate that. You keep pointing to that. You make that, you put that on all of your literature. You take people on, if it's a house or a new building, you take people on tours of that. And then once you keep asking them, you see, we listened to you, we heard you, this is what we did. Now we want to scale up. We're going to do 2 buildings. We're going to do 4 buildings. We're going to do an entire block. You trust us because we've already delivered on what we said we were going to do in a much smaller scale. But now, do you trust us to move ahead, to get more money, more financing, have more involvement, and have more outcomes? So the key takeaways: if it's an environment of polarity and complexity, then think small initially, work as fast as you can, celebrate success, and rinse and repeat.
Thank you, Ben. All right, now over to Tyran. Tyran, enlighten us.
It's a huge task right there. Can everybody? You right? It does sound like it. Everybody can hear me though. Okay, so a little bit about myself. As you said, I'm the local and regional policy officer, the North Carolina Housing Coalition. You guys should have our one-pagers in your hand. We create those every year just to identify the different needs and gaps and opportunity areas across the state. We do it for each of the 100 counties, and we're the only, that I'm aware of, the only statewide housing advocacy organization working at all levels of government. And so in my role, I get the unique opportunity to work with governments, city staff, town staff, elected officials, down to the neighborhood level with communities across the state. And so I'm probably 98% wrong with what I'm going to speak on today, but we have plenty of time to Q&A that I can offer some clarity on questions that you all may have. But I wanted to focus on some solutions and how we can help bridge some of the divide that's created by new projects. And so I kind of broke it up into 3 sections. I didn't know who would be here in attendance, so I broke out a community piece, a developers piece, and then a local elected officials and staff component. And so when I get into the community piece, I think that one of the key factors is bringing elected officials and staff into your communities and neighborhoods. A lot of what I consider to be NIMBYism and the blowback that manifests at council meetings during rezoning requests, oftentimes I think stem from a lack of engagement and a lack of relationship. And by having them come and recognize how these different plans would affect the fabric of a neighborhood is really the solution to building better relationships. And how do you, think through Sorry about that. How do you think through building in an intentional way so that those residents aren't displaced or disheartened at the point where new opportunities comes? Because as we know, everyone is moving into North Carolina because it's a wonderful state, but we have to have a place to house everybody without displacing people in the process. And so I think that inviting them to neighborhood events or community block club meetings and different things like that really put a face to those rezoning requests and those opportunities that come before them that they're voting on. Coming together and building coalitions within those neighborhoods and communities is always great. You have a lot of neighborhood divide at the point where you're faced with these different opportunities, and bringing everybody together to really talk about what do we want our community to look like, and building out those plans of, well, we would like to see it grow in this way, and like welcoming in this type of development, and partnering with advocacy organizations and developers on how does that look, or how would that be able to play out in our community, and then taking those plans to council and staff so that they then aren't looking from the outside, but they also have a document in front of them that they can use to influence some of the decisions that they're making. The third thing is working with developers on proposed projects. A lot of the work that I do is playing the middleman between the communities and our developers council to help mend some of the broken hearts and the difficulty areas that arise. It's not that developers are always trying to come in and tear down communities and just reshape the fabric of neighborhoods and kick everybody out, but it's often that they see an opportunity to enhance communities, but they don't always get the buy-in from the residents in the process of what would they like to see or how would they like to help that process along. And so building those intentional spaces and conversations within communities and working together, collaborate in ways that I believe that have proven to be successful across the state thus far. For developers, I identified engage, engage, engage. We recognize that a lot of developers don't have the capacity to necessarily go to all of the towns, the meetings at the neighborhood level and everything, but investing as much as possible into those opportunities and key. You have a lot of nonprofits and advocacy groups that will love to play the middleman to help convene some of those groups where it's not as much friction as caused as a result whenever proposals are moved forward or whenever they're trying to build new development in some of these communities. Another piece is educating your elected officials and building relationships. A lot of common mistakes that I found with developers that we work with is they assume that elected officials are experts on everything affordable housing, which they have a lot of things that they are supposed to be masters and experts on. And so just really taking an opportunity to invite them out to other communities you've built, other developments that you have, to let them see what your product looks like and how you'll go about building, and that it will be quality and it won't be substandard housing or any of those negative labels that get placed on affordable housing. I think is a very good way to educate them for future projects, but also to help build that relationship whenever there's another opportunity for the developer. And then for both, I would suggest holding the elected officials and staff accountable. So a lot of towns and local governments develop plans and priority areas of where we're going to focus our time, our investment, and they don't always live up to those expectations. And so when you have those documents, when you have those opportunities where council members or staff or whoever may be involved have gone on record saying that this is where our priority is going to be and these are the areas we're going to focus on, really holding them to that and not letting the projects that may not help advance those priorities move forward. And so in worst case scenario, there's always the option of getting your trusted friends at the media involved to help influence some of those processes as well. But I definitely recognize or would recommend relationship building with those elected officials and town staff to figure out what your part is in everybody's individual role to advance a lot of those priorities that they're establishing. And last but not least, for the elected officials and staff, I would encourage them to empower the constituents so they get their buy-in in the process and the priorities that they're setting and recognize where the needs are, because sometimes market analysis don't always identify where the greatest needs are of the community members and what they would like to see built in their neighborhoods. And so having that buy-in to influence the process when you develop these priorities could help mend a lot of those broken relationships that come as a result of it. education and public outreach, going into the communities and going to the developers and everyone partnering to have these convenings that everyone is being transparent and open and honest and discussing in a forum setting like what we're looking to do, how we see the visioning of the future playing out for our city or our town or our county, and really working collectively as coalition to build out those plans rather than all of these segmented pieces that may go on throughout the process. And so inclusion is something I always advocate for. And then the last part is compassion and communication. I feel like in a lot of cases there's been mislabel that may come out, so saying a poverty study or a displacement study rather than an opportunity study or an area of revitalization, and just really recognizing how that message affects different populations that are all looking to build and remain in some of the places that they feel like they may be displaced from. And so, and a lot of the work that I've done has been simply put as if, well, you're saying that you're looking to relocate some of the houses or some of the neighbors that we currently have, and that's not necessarily the case, is that they're looking to invite in future community members while allowing people to remain in space. But simple miscommunications and things that you don't even think about always could damage some of those relationships before you even have the opportunity to get some buy-in and influence in the process. And so that's really all I have to say. I'm open for any questions. I don't really know if I discussed what I was supposed to discuss in the first place, but yes.
All right. Let's thank Tyran. All right, I thought I would just start us out with a few questions, and then we'll open it up a little bit more. It looks like we've got about 25 minutes, so we were hoping to have a lot of time. Just a couple things real quick that I wanted to make sure that we got to today, particularly rural strategies. And so, Ben, you've talked about your area, Tyran, or work in this area. Tyran, your work extends to small communities, rural areas all over the state. Oftentimes, one of the criticisms I hear, and I've worked in rural areas as well, about the way we talk about policy at these kind of convenings is that it has limited applicability to rural areas. So I was hoping that you could talk about what the some of the unique challenges are in that area. And I thought that this would also give us a chance to talk about just engaging with county governments as well, who often have the budget to be in a place to think a little bit more regionally and be able to think about the strategy, throughout the multiple municipalities in their area. So, all right. So, anyone want to bite at that? You want to start us off, Ben?
Okay, well, this is terrible because the two biggest experts in rural policy are sitting here, and Sarah Thompson and Stacy Guffey. So, but I think they would agree with most of the things I'm going to say. First of all, rural areas are different. Are different. If you take a rural area and just look at the geographic boundaries, they are different from urban areas and their geographic boundaries. But inside every rural area are towns, and towns are closer in their approach and their needs and their capacities to cities. And in neighborhoods in big cities are people whose attitudes and concerns are closer to rural areas' attitudes and concerns. When I was working in Western Carolina, it was very interesting to see the kind of pushback I got in Western Carolina for public outreach and for policy issues often had to do with property rights, and so that I had the privilege of one guy who's now a county commissioner in Cherokee County doing a YouTube video in which he called me a communist. And so then when I came to Asheville and talked about policy issues in neighborhood associations that were empowered by their process, they called me a right-wing Republican. And so I think that the one thing is don't think everybody you're going to be talking to, just because they live in a particular geography or even a particular neighborhood, is characterized, their identity is entirely characterized by that. I think it's also important not to characterize people's identity by race, ethnic, or sexual orientation. There are people who are different. You know, you have to do the hard part of listening to them, listening to the individuals and what bubbles out of those kinds of conversations. I mean, paying attention is the best advice I ever got about anything, whether it's a personal relationship or the politics of land use development. So that's the first thing. But having said that, there are crises in rural America now that are overwhelming the capacities for those rural areas. The opioid crises, also a deficiency of investment in those areas. That they are overwhelming the rural areas in many ways. They happen to in a lot of neighborhoods in cities back in the 1960s and 1970s. And so I think listening to where that need is coming from, sometimes listening to what people need to tell you is more important about what they mean than about what they're saying. Sometimes what they say is anger and resentment and frustration and confusion and hopelessness. That's the language they use. Sometimes what they really mean is what they're really looking for is pathways out of that. And so if you can figure out a way to negotiate to allow people to vent their frustrations and then begin to help them test pathways out of that, it's the same. It amounts to the same kind of process whether you're working in rural or cities. I mean, is that okay, Sarah? Stacey, am I close? Yeah, know your audience. Yeah. So I could have just said that. Know your audience. Okay.
I think the most important thing you said was not to put everybody in the same bucket. A lot of times that happens. People who don't work in rural areas, they assume, especially in the South, that people are going to live the same political persuasion, the same kind of thoughts about government intervention and local issues.
Yeah, I may have just made one in the way I framed the question even. Just to repeat for the video, what Stacy just said was that being careful about thinking about people in the same bucket and placing all the people who live in a rural area or an urban area or part of any demographic group, the thinking that you understand the entire group. So over to you, Tyra.
Sure. So I'll briefly add on that I think the biggest advantage that we have in our rural communities is something that we don't have in the more urban cores, and that is access to land. That is some prime real estate in a lot of these rural communities, and thinking through those strategies require more intentional regional planning. And so you alluded to it already, that it requires multiple counties sometimes to come together and think through meeting needs and how can we align our different goals so that we're accomplishing what's best for the region, and also to not make the assumption that all urban areas or all rural areas want to be urban areas, and that's the way that we need to build them. A lot of them have unique fabric that they look to preserve and maintain, and figuring out how to leverage those township cores or those downtowns that have been robust in previous years and just need a little bit of investment to get them back up and running again. And just thinking through a lot of those strategies. The rural community is very unique, and so it means it requires unique solutions as well to meet those needs, and to not think that it's a cookie cutter solution that can be applied to all of the different communities.
Thank you. So one other that I wanted to get at, because I think you'll both have different perspectives on this, it's kind of a two-part question. The housing bond that just passed out here in the city of Asheville. Ben, you're a resident. In Tyran, you've seen similar types of campaigns around these issues throughout the state. What we've got here, from at least an outside perspective, because I don't work in government either, is we had a big, ambitious idea that was successful. And in fact, a lot of people were very surprised by how successful it was here. Well over 60%, from what I understand, and in the way it passed. So, first part of my question is, with the big idea, I understand the incremental idea being the way to build people around an idea, but with the big idea, is there something different about the way you wage that campaign? The second piece is the political environment in North Carolina is often the case. If you try to get too ambitious on the local level, you're going to put your neck out and get it chopped off by Raleigh. So how do you balance that? How do you work that balance, and how do you create the campaign for the ambitious idea, but you also communicate with the state legislature or try to be careful in the priorities that you pick? Hot potato. Yeah.
So I'm a little biased because I actually worked on the Asheville housing bond campaign, so I'm excited that it passed. That is a loaded question. I think that local governments are recognizing the significant decrease in federal and state funds, and recognizing that they have to step in and intervene in a way that they have not done previously. And because they're not used to the amount of funding and appropriations that it will require to truly meet the need, that it requires innovative strategies, with bonds being one of the more desirable solutions in the state of North Carolina because of the different regulations and authority powers that exist or don't exist for local governments. And so I'll say that I think every local government I've had a conversation with has a fly under the radar mentality right now. And so maximizing the amount of investment that you can secure without alarming or causing any red flags at the state level is the strategy. And so bond referendums tend to be the way to get the largest investments and largest impacts. And so I think that's why and I mean, you saw it across the state. Greensboro had 25 million, Charlotte had 15 million, Orange County, Carrboro had another 5 million. So like, you saw these campaigns around the state, and I'm actually having conversations with 2 other local governments next week about possibility of a bond campaign and referendum. And so I think you frame it as, we need innovative solutions now. You point out the actual need so that the community will understand why this large bond actually is something that could benefit the community, and then you put it forth for the people to decide.
I didn't know that you worked on the Asheville bond. Ben, how did Asheville shape up in its campaign? What would you have done different? Maybe throw that in there too.
Well, I would have asked for more money, because there's only the certain number of times you can go back to voters and ask them to give you money. So I think you ought to. A lot of the money in that bond is just to make up for things that the city's behind on, and so essentially just like paying debts that you're in arrears for. So I think any kind of bond issue, I mean, that's a contribution. So I would frame it more as a small step, as one of the small steps, not as a big thing. But I think the next thing to do is to make sure that money gets spent in ways on some kind of project you can immediately celebrate. When we talked about earlier, you got to be able to point to something that comes out of that bond money that everybody recognizes is a real achievement, so that can be replicated and scaled up. So that's. But I was thinking about getting a T-shirt printed up that on the front it says "Raise my taxes," because I think anybody who does what we do and stands in front of a group and asking governments to hit goals of affordable housing should be also willing to say, at some point you have to raise my taxes.
Okay, I can kick in with a couple more questions, but I'd like to open it up to you all if you have some. You had a question earlier? I'm going to just come out to you here.
My basic question is, what is it that this flyer, Tryon, says here?
provide 20 million to the North Carolina Housing Trust Fund, provide 35 million to the Workforce Housing Loan Program. What does that really mean? What can North Carolina do to help? Well, so they've got this allocated, and how much of that is for Buncombe County or Western North Carolina? Is that what you mean? I mean, are you involved with these?
Yes,
Organizations.
So that is part of our larger state campaign. And so those are two state level programs that we're advocating for. I believe they're currently funded at around 15 million and 8 million respectively. So those are the one pages we use when we took it to the General Assembly to advocate for an increase in statewide funding. So those are two programs we were trying to beef up by the upwards of 25 to 30 million dollars, where they previously had higher allocations, and we've seen cuts in funding since I guess around 2008, 2010ish. And so it's not necessarily a direct appropriation to any individual county or municipality, but it's more about increasing the availability of funding so that the local governments can leverage against the state fundings without almost bankrupting themselves while trying to meet the needs.
And who's privy to that funding? Does it go through some of the not-for-profits that are here? And certain developers that work in affordable housing?
Yeah, so it's she asked who benefits from the programming. Is it developers or nonprofits in the area? And so it's going to be a wide range of people who benefit from, but it does include the developers, the nonprofits, the people who are producing the affordable units on the ground. And that's why we try to maximize. The North Carolina Housing Finance Agency has direct state appropriations to which a lot of the tax credit deals are financed through. And so as different gap financing programs and different ways of leveraging additional funding, it's like another way of adding to the opportunities or the different resources we can tap into to help meet the needs.
I could just ask a little follow-up question. I believe you have those two-page infographics for every one of the 100 counties, right? At least I'd like to put this question to you, and Ben, please chime in if you have something. So talking about other media, right? Getting beyond storytelling, beyond, strategizing in the campaign. What about infographics, social media, video? How important has that become in summarizing complex ideas quickly and reaching people that you haven't reached before?
Sure. So I'll say specifically at the state level that Samuel Gunter, who you guys are going to hear from next, is going to do a legislative update. But when it comes to us working at the General Assembly, that you only get a couple of minutes to give your elevator pitch. And so one pages such as these, they're like, specific elected officials have said we want something very basic. What is the need in my area? How many people are affected? And what programs will best help meet those needs? And so it's coming up with those unique things that are eye-catching, that have different colors, that pop and stand out to them, have been rather successful in the different campaigns that we've worked on around increasing housing funding. And now it's the age of social media. Everybody has a Twitter and a Facebook and all these other media outlets that they leverage and they rely on. And so as you know of Twitter, a lot of elected officials use, but you only get 140 characters to type what you really need. So it's about being as concise in a lot of these conversations as possible while still expressing and explaining the biggest needs area. And so in our updated versions, we're going to add, we have intentions on adding on eviction rates as another statistic, because we feel like that's often lost in the affordable housing conversation of someone being evicted and back into housing and evicted again, and what that turnover looks like. And so I think that in the changing demographics and in the years to come, it's going to be about how can you communicate what's important to me that I care about when I only have 30 seconds while I'm walking in between committee meetings to really grasp and understand the important points from this.
You have anything, Ben? Okay. All right. And any other questions out here? All right. We've got about 10 more minutes. Let me go here, and I've got one last one I'll pitch at them too.
Going back to the rural issue, housing is a real essential piece of economic development. For example, in Silva, where I live, we have a university down the road. Well, a lot of people that work at the university would live in Silva if there was housing of the type that they want, but there's not, and so they live in other counties or commute from Asheville even. The local governments in rural areas don't have a lot of money and are trying to take care of basic infrastructure. So then it becomes, how do you tell the story of that as an investment opportunity? And in order for the town to actually be able to grow, you increase the tax base, you increase the amount of businesses that can succeed there just by giving people a place to live of the type of housing they want to live in. Investors are flocking to Asheville. How do we get them to rural areas?
All right, who would like that one? I think you're up.
Well, first of all, the good news is that cities like Asheville can't accommodate all the people who want to live in Western North Carolina, and that's what we're seeing happen. If you drive at any place south of here on 26, almost any time of the day now, you see this horrendous amount of traffic there because there are people who rely on Asheville for almost everything they want to do for working and entertaining themselves, but they think they can't afford to live in Asheville, and that may be true, and so they're locating what we call drive till you qualify. You keep moving farther and farther out. The challenge for Silva and Franklin and other of the smaller towns is the same one that you and Stacy have been fighting for years, is to try to strengthen those towns so that you give them a level of amenities, of urban amenities that are appropriate for a village or a small town as opposed to appropriate for a big city. And so that's the hard sell, as we know, is to say we can. There are plenty of people in this country. There's a very high percentage, as a matter of fact, that say they want to live in a small town. But small towns, when they go and visit potential places, especially very, very affordable places like Silva and Franklin and others, they find that they're so lacking in amenities that they're used to that they can't, and it's a chicken and egg deal. Right. But as you know, many of the leaders in those areas are very reluctant to promote the kinds of land use and transportation policies that make it easy to do the kind of investment that bring more people in denser environments that create more retail and more entertainment sections. So it's a major political problem. However, the opportunities for doing that, with all these people who say they want to live in Western North Carolina and who are priced out of Asheville, there are people looking around. They're driving around, looking around, and so I think the continuing challenge is for I don't want to say, I'm trying to keep myself from saying changing the leadership, but let's say influencing the leadership in those areas to see the bottom line potential for making the small town. They claim they have these great small towns, but making those small towns really as good as what they promise.
All right. If there are no other questions, I'll put this one to you, and I'll let you take it however you'd like. So, thinking about new projects, that word was chosen because it's vague, right? So I'm thinking about the large campaign down to the individual project placed in a neighborhood, and I think that this is something that will actually be applicable beyond housing. Possibly even to, a capital campaign for your nonprofit, or, selling your local community on preparing parcels to possibly look at some economic development incentives and bringing people. So basically, what are the bare essentials? If you were going to tell an organization, like, these are the two things you need to have out there that you need to make sure you prioritize, the two things, the three things, the bare essentials. what would it be?
Well, the number one thing is to have a strategy to build alliances, to build a coalition, to build people who can help give elected leaders the courage of their convictions. In Nashville, we elect a lot of people who have very strong convictions about very progressive ideas, but as soon as there's pushback, this happens everywhere. As soon as there's pushback from a neighbor that doesn't want anything built anywhere close to them, including on the vacant lot that they don't own, as soon as an elected official hears from that person, then they begin to stifle the kinds of projects that need to be done to create the kinds of opportunities that are necessary. So everything is about building the alliances. It's a political movement. It's just like you address coalitions to help get elected. You have to address coalitions, build them into alliances, so that when that one person or that group shows up at a public hearing and says they don't want any of these folks from outside in their town, or they don't want any of these cottage clusters or whatever is going to happen in there, there's another group of people who will stand up and say, well, no, we're really for that. And it would help if those people are really business people and influential people that are respected in the community. So that my two things now in this stage of my career is to be an advocate of coalition building, of building alliances, and to get stuff done. Nothing beats getting stuff done, even if it's a tiny little thing that you can point to as a success story, is to get stuff done and to build coalitions that make getting stuff done easier.
Oh, all right. I'll just say on Ben's point too, often the resistance coming from a neighborhood association, there's one person there at that public hearing, and they only have negative things to say. So if you want to be an advocate, go and say, yes, we want this in our community, because really it's just a matter of the one voice that shows up, often gets far too much weight.
In terms of getting stuff done, I'm wondering if any of you all can speak to your experience in using or helping build health impact assessments, if you could speak to that. I work within our public health. It's something that we haven't really had much utilization of in our region, but it is something that, because of a lot of the numbers that we're seeing that relate to health equity, that it's possibly a conversation or a tool we should explore.
So I have not directly used them, but Greensboro has a great model where the Greensboro Housing Coalition, the UNCG Center for Housing and Community Studies, and the Greensboro Department for Health and the DSS office there are all collaborating around a strategic housing development plan around asthma as it affects. And so I know they have a good model there. You could go to Greensboro Housing Coalition's page and find out more information with that. And what they did was they did an initial study and took it to the Cone healthcare providers in Greensboro to help get them involved in the process as well. And some financial backing came from their foundation or subsidiary organization that does community investment work. And so trying to get all of the pieces involved is the model that they use. I don't know if that helps to answer your question, but that's the model I'm familiar with.
We did a health impact assessment for our 7-county region, and the product for it was a public health chapter for each of the county's comprehensive plans. Speaking to Ben's leadership comments, that's the barrier, is that you can put all this data in front of them and say smaller lot sizes, more people in town, more sidewalks, more opportunities for folks to use something other than their car. It's good for public health. You can put all that data in front of them, but actually turning it into policy change has been our barrier, and that's a leadership issue. So it really is varied community by community who's embraced that idea that public health and public infrastructure planning go together. It really varies depending on who's in charge, unfortunately.
One of the things I really like about working in rural communities is how many people are interconnected through friendships and often through their families. And quite often, the health department director is related to people who are in leadership. When the health department director stands up and says, if we don't change the way we're doing something, we're harming the children and the older people in our community, and you need to be paying attention to this, his or her cousin sitting on the commission board has to pay attention. I like that that's a good thing about the good old boy networks in rural counties.
All right, and with that, we are out of time. Thank you all for coming today. Can you help me give a hand to Tyran and Ben?